Hi everyone, welcome to another virtual BEAT Talk event. My name is Fotini Pitoglu and I'm an executive member of BEAT. Joining me today is Shona Seligman, also an executive member of BEAT.
Hi everyone, we're honored today to have Ila Berman for tonight's BEAT Talk. BEAT Talks are a series of discussions held at the offices of various architects across the city. Hosts will share their learned experience. This talk is being recorded, but all participants' microphones and webcams were muted upon entry. You'll be able to submit questions at any point during the presentation, and they will be read aloud during the second half of the event in a Q&A session. Please type all of your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom center of the screen here, and you'll have the option to leave your name or ask anonymously. The chat box just to the right of the Q&A can be used for any immediate troubleshooting assistance. This webinar qualifies for one OAA Con Ed hour. However, you must stay for its whole duration to receive the certificate.
And now I would like to introduce Ila Berman. Ila Berman is the Dean of the School of Architecture and Edward D. Elson Professor at the University of Virginia and Principal of Scale Shift Design. She's an architect, theorist, and curator of architecture and urbanism, whose research investigates the relationship between culture and the evolution of contemporary material, technological, and spatial practices. She is a featured alumna of Harvard University's Grounded Visionary Series and the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, including the Lieutenant Governor's Medal for Design, a Special Achievement Award from the American Institute of Architects, and the President's Award for Excellence in Teaching from Tulane University, where she was a favorite professor, founding director of the Urban Build program, and the Associate Dean of the School of Architecture until 2007. At the University of Virginia, Berman is the founder of the Next Cities Institute, an interdisciplinary research center focused on the design of global urban futures, and the editor of the Next Cities book series. Berman's work and publications include Expanded Field, Architectural Installation Beyond Art, Flux, Architecture in a Parametric Landscape, Urban Build Local Global, and New Constellations, New Ecologies, among others. She's also the creator of New Orleans, Urban Operations for a Future City, an exhibition at 2006 International Architecture Biennale in Venice, Italy, and co-designer of WBA3, Architecture in the Expanded Field at the Wattis Institute for Contemporary Arts in San Francisco, and Urban Syncopation, an installation exhibited at Nuit Blanche at the Garner Museum in Toronto, most recently exhibited in the Data and Matter exhibition at the 2018 Venice Biennale. Ila, we're excited to listen to your presentation. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Fotini, and thank you, Shana, for the invitation. I'm going to just share my screen and start with that. Can everybody see that? Great. Well, my talk today, Beyond Equality, Regendering Architectural Education, began as part of a symposium at the University of Pennsylvania, which was published last year in a book entitled Women Rebuild, Stories, Polemics, and Futures. And when asked what the role is that architectural education plays in the forming of women practitioners, my immediate response might simply be to educate them with all the means that we have available to become successful architects. But as an architect, not only as an architect, an educator, and a dean, but also a feminist, I'm fully aware that this response is inadequate because it neither acknowledges the implicit and explicit forms of sexism that still exist within the academy and the profession, nor the gender-biased ideological frameworks that are underpinning the architectural discipline in general. We have too often assumed that the issues that women are confronted with, both at the school and the workplace, are solely centered around issues of equality. That is, the equal right and opportunity for women to compete and succeed within an existing system without questioning the biased value system that's deeply embedded within what is often presented as a gender-neutral education, profession, or environment. So if we examine our current struggles against the backdrop of more than a century's efforts of women's activism, it becomes clear that despite all that we've achieved, we're still fundamentally operating within a context that's reminiscent of the first waves of liberal feminism of the 19th and early 20th centuries. From this era onward, women's efforts have primarily been centered around the issue of women's equality, based on the argument that the only fundamental differences between men and women have been artificially socially constructed, and that women should be granted the same educational opportunities and professional opportunities as men. The women's rights movement was therefore directed towards increasing women's presence within the public realm by liberating women from gender oppression and in many cases overtly negating gender roles, while simultaneously transforming the institutions and laws that have historically kept women in disadvantaged positions through things like sexual socialization, sexual discrimination, lack of access to education and job training, unequal wages, and lack of recognition and advancement within the workplace, among others. And progress on this front has been accomplished by ensuring that our social and political institutions and their structures are vigilant in warranting equal access to education, to legal rights, and professional advancement, not only by intensifying awareness of these issues, but more importantly, through legal instruments, policy, and direct action. And these efforts have occupied the majority of the women's movement as a whole, and over the last 3 decades are responsible for the rapidly increasing population of women in universities, and more specifically within architectural programs throughout North America. And although Canadian universities are much younger, many American universities were either segregated or denied women access until as late as the 1960s and 70s, when the Supreme Court backing of civil rights legislation threatened the prejudices against women that had kept them out of institutions of higher education. And I should also note, and this is an image of the signing of the Civil Rights Act, and you can see, you know, there's no women in the room. And I should note that in the US, the first Civil Rights Act in 1964 made no mention of women at all. So despite its 200-year history, the University of Virginia, where I'm Dean of the School of Architecture, only first fully admitted women into the university in 1971. And what this means is that for more than 150 of its 200 years, UVA was exclusively for white Christian men. The importance of the emergence of this institution as one of the first public universities that would be both secular and ensure access to education for all was to create, in the words of Thomas Jefferson, an enlightened and educated democracy. And yet for the vast majority of its history, this institution still excluded women, since women throughout history were not considered to be part of what constituted this so-called public. In Canada, women were not considered to be persons under Canadian law until 1929. So feminists often refer to history literally as his story, since almost the entirety of our Western history is a history written by men, primarily about themselves, their values, their desires, and their accomplishments. Women were historically deprived not only of the right to be educated and the right to a profession, but also of the more basic human right to exist within the public sphere. In being relegated to the realm of the invisible, women were therefore marginalized within humanity itself. The human norm functions by transposing a very specific mode of being human into a generalized standard that then acquires transcendent value as the human. So we move from male to masculine and onto human as the universalized format of humanity. And this standard gets posited as being categorically and qualitatively distinct from sexualized, racialized, and naturalized others. And continually reminding ourselves of these hidden facts by exposing the highly gendered specificity behind histories that present themselves as normative or neutral is part of what it means to be a feminist. In the article, The Question of the Other, it's made clear that Western philosophy, which is the the ideological structure upon which humanism was based, was essentially constructed around a single subject. For centuries, no one imagined that different subjects existed, or that man and woman might, in particular, might actually be different subjects. The fundamental model of the human being remained unchanged, right? One singular, solitary, historically male subject, and this was, of course, the paradigm of the Western adult male. Even in architecture, when this model gets modernized, as in Le Corbusier's modular, it's still the model of the human male that later was metricized as the rational model of Cartesian space, that in this case evicts the body entirely. And we could say the body itself already sort of stands in historically for the feminine, or for the material. But within the model of Cartesianism, the body is evicted from consideration at all. Diversity was thus thought of and experienced always in a hierarchical manner, the many others always subjugated by the one. Others, the idea of otherness, others were always only imperfect copies of the idea or the ideal of man, which all others had to struggle to equal. And that's where the notion of equality, of course, comes from. So what's important in this is that these imperfect copies were not defined as different subjects, but rather were defined in terms of an ideal subject and as a function of their inadequacies with respect to that ideal in relation to age, sex, race, culture, and so on. So even if included, others would always be thought to be secondary, imperfect examples with respect to a singular male subject. In 1972, the US Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights enforced Title IX of the Educational Amendments. And this was in order to protect people in educational programs that receive government funding from discrimination based on sex. And for the United States, this single piece of legislation basically changed the course of history for women in educational institutions. Despite the limitations on this legislation to institutions and programs that receive federal funds, it basically mandated that any institution that was receiving public funding could not discriminate based on sex, which is the reason that the University of Virginia admitted women, was this piece of legislation. And this paralleled what was the Canadian Human Rights Act of 1977. And it's a very short time frame within which women therefore gained access to higher education. But by the mid-1980s, and in every year since, more undergraduate and graduate degrees have been conferred on women than men in the United States, and the same in Canada since the early 1990s, which proved the earlier assertions of the women's movement that women would excel in institutions of higher learning once given equal opportunity. Traditionally masculinized professions such as architecture, however, have taken much longer to reach equal numbers of both female applicants and students. And in 2016, the National Architectural Accrediting Board indicated that 46% of the 24,000 enrolled students in architecture programs were female, and 43% of its degrees were awarded to women. And this shows you how this occurred in Canada from 1900 to 2006. Women entering architecture schools is up at the top and men at the bottom. And of course, it's only, you can see in the last, since the 2000s, that these essentially became equal. So it's only in recent years that schools of architecture in the US and Canada, those that were once the bastions of white males, are now approaching equal numbers of women. It's close to 50 years since this early legislation against sex discrimination in education was passed. And of course, we now live in a very different time where the number of female architecture students and graduates is steadily climbing. Our work, however, continues, but in a very different way, I would say. And this includes not only protecting legislation that's come under siege by misogynist protagonists within our current political climate, but also ensuring that we continue to examine the gendered ideologies that are still entrenched within architectural academia as well as in the profession. Female students require female mentors to succeed, just as female faculty depend on support at senior administrative levels for their advancement. That's one of my jobs, let's say, as dean. The comparative percentages, though, of female professors of architecture have trailed behind those of female architecture students, while also decreasing as you move upwards toward leadership roles. And this, which shows leadership in architecture schools across North America, this is almost, and this is the most recent chart, is almost double what it was only 7 years ago. And this is in part because it's taken years to produce a comparable percentage of women competing for positions within schools of architecture, but more importantly, it's because of the slow rate of turnover within academia and the gender biases that occur within hiring procedures and promotion. Given the context of tenure and lifetime appointments in education, evolution in full-time faculty of architecture schools is very slow, because unless there's growth, positions only open up when individuals retire. And for most schools, there isn't a retirement age, and the competition for these positions is extremely high. We also operate in a field where peer review dominates in hiring processes, promotion, awards, and all forms of recognition. And because of women's persistent invisibility within male-centric systems and the cloning mechanisms that implicitly operate through such practices of advancement, the percentages of women in architecture radically decrease as one moves towards more senior positions or higher level honors and recognitions. Equality in peer review also demands equality in gender representation throughout such processes, right? That those that are fulfilling the committees, those that are on the juries, that there's equal representation. But equal representation, even though it seldom occurs, even this doesn't guarantee a true culture shift, given the propensity for internalized sexism among women who've succeeded within patriarchal systems, and the need for conceptual tools to help us confront this. So efforts towards equity within architecture and the elimination of hidden forms of gender bias are absolutely necessary and vital. But my argument in a way is that these actions still correspond to a very moderate position in relation to the emancipation of women, primarily because the framework upon which these actions depend is still uncritically assimilationist. Models of equality are at most a superficial critique of culture because they don't question the underlying ideologies that structure our social values and the pervasive complicity of those values considered to be normative with patriarchal values. Those that are rooted in maintaining what Russell Ferguson has referred to as the invisible center or the mythical norm, the white, young, heterosexual, Christian, financially secure adult male, the place from which power is exerted, and that defines the standard against which all sexualized and racialized others are measured. Since man stands in for and has become the universal signifier for humanity in general. And this is, of course, why when we see rooms, review panels, boards, juries, symposia that are populated almost entirely by men, time and time again, no one seems to notice. And we certainly don't imagine that the focus of these gatherings is on men's issues, even if that might implicitly be the case. And yet if we see the same rooms, panels, boards, juries, and symposia populated by women, we automatically assume that they must be dealing with issues that are specifically related to women. That women's rights aren't intrinsically considered to be human rights, but rather a subcategory of rights supporting a special interest group is because humanity, akin to our notions of the public, has historically been gendered as male. So Hillary Clinton's dictum when she said women's rights are human rights and human rights are women's rights is a critical statement that calls attention to how we might rethink and address this issue. So in order to problematize the question of equality for women, a psychoanalyst and theorist, Luce Irigaray, wrote, she said, demanding equality as women is, it seems to me, a mistaken expression of a real objective. The demand to be equal presupposes a point of comparison. To whom or to what do women want to be equalized? To men, to a salary, to a public office, to what standard? And the most important thing she asks is why not to themselves? Her critique demands an investigation of the ideological underpinnings of the question of equality in order to more radically redefine the issues that are facing women. She rejects the idea that as women, we should continue to be defined in relation to the very structures that are responsible or that were responsible for our disenfranchisement. Rather, women should reposition themselves at the center instead of the margins and ask the larger question, what is it that women want? So in her essay, Equal or Different, she states that since the exploitation of women is based upon sexual difference, it can therefore only be resolved through sexual difference. And here she's also critiquing what is the wholesale neutralization of sex, or the reduction of biological difference when we talk about male versus female to socially constructed difference, the feminine or masculine. To suppress this condition is not only to negate the very specific and violent history that led to women's subordination enforced by and for men, but also, in a more positive vein, to ignore the distinct values that might emerge from this difference. Values to which women might subscribe and that would radically question the highly gendered, masculinist, and anthropocentric norms to which we have all assimilated. So difference refers to different subjects and different subjectivities. Earlier, socialist feminists were criticized for privileging masculinist values, right? The public, social, political, and economic spheres, while diminishing those that had been historically gendered as feminine, the private, bodily, psychic, and aesthetic. Further, feminist advocates of difference claim that it's not simply that real women are oppressed within educational, legal, and economic structures, but also that this oppression is implicated by the way in which the feminine has been simultaneously repressed in language, in philosophy, and in culture. Just the idea of the bachelor's degree. We couldn't imagine a spinster's degree, and if you laugh at the idea of the feminized equivalent, right, of a bachelor's degree, it's because we see spinster is already a derogatory term and not an achievement. It's not seen to be the same way as a bachelor. Theorists of sexual difference advance the feminism that would not only be critical of patriarchy, but also be creatively affirmative in producing a new agenda. So they stress the necessity for women to write, speak, design, and construct their own material and conceptual futures. Irigaray is certainly not advocating that sexuality wholly define our professional lives, but rather that we recognize differences that are critical to our reformulation of cultural, educational, and professional values as women. She writes, one of the main obstacles to the creation and recognition of such values is the more or less obscure hold patriarchal models have had for centuries over the entirety of our civilization. It is simply a matter of social justice to balance out this power of the one sex over the other by giving or giving back cultural values to female sexuality. These theorists of sexual difference interrogated assumptions about equality by questioning the assimilation of women to male normative standards, while also scrutinizing the supposed neutrality of their core values. The implicit gender bias hidden behind the structure of a universal norm was therefore exposed by making conspicuous the correspondence between this so-called norm and the self-serving prototype of the white Christian heterosexual male. The mythical norm is obviously perpetuated by those whose interests it serves, but it can also be internalized by those who are oppressed by it. Being a woman, therefore, does not ever automatically make you a feminist, nor does it mean that you will advocate on behalf of women, since our struggles as female architects and educators are implicated by the biases that we have ourselves internalized and the norms to which we've assimilated. And for women, as for any marginalized group, An assimilation to these norms can only be exacted at a price. And that price is the massive repression that demands that you erase your own biology, history, ethnicity, sexuality, values, your own experiences, and you replace them with those of the dominant group, the prevailing, and in this case, patriarchal ideology. And this assimilation occurs through socialization. And it's responsible for what Cornel West refers to as double consciousness, where women, by the nature of our own highly gendered education, have been systematically trained to not only interiorize our own marginality, but also to identify against ourselves. And we can apply this to any form of minority, right? Internalized racism, misogyny, etc. So for those of us that might have succeeded within a male-dominated system, we feel that we are both part of this system, and yet we're still separated from it or marginalized by it. And in order to transform our environment, we must first, therefore, exercise the essential white male subject that's been implanted within each of us. And what better example of the extent of our own double consciousness and internalized misogyny and racism than what we witnessed during the most recent elections in the US, where close to 50% of women voted for an abusive and bullying misogynist, and 1/3 of Hispanics and Asians voted for a racist. And it seems that only African-American women consistently voted with their own identities, subjectivities, and self-interests intact, given that the overlay of race and gender, a form of intensified double marginalization, perhaps provides the much needed inoculation to the schizophrenia of double consciousness, since Black women find themselves neither privileged by being either male or white. And Jonathan Culler had written, he said, the most insidious form of oppression is one that alienates a group from its own interests as a group and encourages it to identify with the interests of its oppressors, so that political struggles must first awaken a group to its own interests and its own experience. And this is, it is what was called consciousness raising in the 70s. It operates as a form of recentering that not only acts to critique the assimilationist model, but also provides an affirmative lens through which to create alternative subjectivities and new frameworks for our discipline. Our highly individualistic, self-centered, and consumption and competition-driven culture cannot therefore be dissociated from the highly gendered place from which it originated. Encouraged, no doubt, by testosterone-infused bodies that consistently celebrate the one over the many while leaving the debris of territorial skirmishes in their wakes. Just as women's equality within architecture can't be pursued without also interrogating and exposing the invisible but highly gendered frameworks and power structures that define both the discipline and the profession. And this critique is intended to lead us toward a more affirmative model that might allow us to imagine both the regendering of our educational models that might integrate feminist perspectives into the classroom, and finally, the regendering of the architectural profession itself. So we have to ask ourselves, what are the values to which we have subscribed within architectural education and practice? Are they our own? And if not, what is it that we can do to transform them? So through this regendering of architecture and architectural education, we might imagine a number of phenomena, and I'm going to put forward a few examples here. First, perhaps we have to replace the archaic image of the heroic white male master designer builder with a broader and more collaborative framework for design, which is more inclusive in both its practice and its modes of recognition. The emphasis on individual autonomy and individualistic success is a highly gendered phenomenon. And of course, in some corners of the profession, this overt emphasis on individual autonomy and overly hierarchical structures of practice are already being replaced by more complex constellations that try to synthesize different forms of expertise, to generate design products that are shared rather than being captured under a single author or owner. Within existing models of architectural authorship, creative forms of work are often rendered invisible under those predominantly male or men that are seen to lead these signature architectural practices. And until this work, and we know that, you know, architectural practices that have 50, 100 people or more operating, and yet often it's a single individual that is named, you know, within these practices. Until this work and those that have generated it are publicly acknowledged as meaningfully contributing to the success of those practices, rather than being subsumed as a form of feminized and mute material labor, will architecture evolve into a more equitable profession. We should therefore also teach students to more effectively collaborate, communicate, share knowledge and experience as an integral part of their education, because the one thing we know is that outside of school, no one ever practices architecture alone. Second, we should also be asking how we advance a more inclusive model that collectively advances excellence rather than exceptionalism, and that supports differently defined qualitative cultural values across scales, practices, domains, and territories. Excellence should be a shared common goal, attained through collective products that are greater than what a single individual firm or institution can provide, and whose value might be considered to be imminent to the material and living energy invested in their making and gleaned from their experience, rather than this value always being determined by comparison to an external standard, metric, or norm. Only when imminent material value is able to withstand being transcoded into abstract exchange value will architecture and design, what we often call the handmaidens of capitalism, be able to resist their wholesale commodification. And this is especially critical at a time where the exchange value of space and property, for example, real estate, right, outstrips the true value of the architectural works being exchanged. Third, it's important that we recognize the diversification of opportunities for which we are educating students and the importance of what we learn in an interdisciplinary environment. Landscape architectures lead, for example, in defining new ecological and environmental models, have enabled us to rethink architecture and urbanism in terms of their metabolic, material, and performative processes. And this has been transformative for the profession and education, and also for expanding models of subjectivity. As stated by the feminist scholar Rosi Braidotti, a powerful source of inspiration for contemporary reconfigurations of critical posthumanism is ecology and environmentalism. They rest on an enlarged sense of interconnection between the self and others, including non-human or earth others. Understanding that the larger biosphere is a support for all forms of life, human and non-human, is critical for our collective future and something that we should recognize as both a feminist and an ecological issue, since often the raping and instrumentalization of the environment and the exploitation of women, both of which are considered to be vital and material others, have historically gone hand in hand. And just as human rights are women's rights, so are social justice issues equally feminist issues, asking us also to ask the question, who has traditionally benefited, and alternatively, who should benefit from architectural and urban expertise? Why is not design that is in service of the public good located at the core rather than the periphery of our practices? Some of the projects that are part of our Next Cities research, for example, at UVA, focus on pressing challenges like planetary urbanization and environmental degradation that are key to the Yamuna River project in Delhi that's been running for many years, or vast territories like those in the Arctic whose transformation is occurring at an unprecedented rate with research led by our Arctic Design Group. And this is absolutely critical. These territories For example, the endless urbanization of unplanned settlements that we're seeing around the globe constitute a massive form of feminine planetary matter that's often hidden or overlooked, understood as existing somehow beyond or outside the purview of professional architectural interests that need to be addressed in collaboration with other disciplines. There are many other conditions within architecture that have strategically been rethought by women in many ways that I would categorize as feminist practices, such as the importance of the attribution and development of surface practices in the work of Farshid Musavi, and the strategic repositioning of ornament through function and surface through structure, two pairs of dualisms that have always been historically gendered. Within the larger context of advanced architectural educational institutions, it's also important that we are repositioning design at the center rather than the periphery of research. This needs to happen both through the redevelopment of design-based research methodologies within architecture and also by exporting design education, its synthetic methodologies, its approach to experiential learning, its focus on creative making or problem solving and experimentation, exporting this to other disciplines. Nurturing the vital and creative impulse is intrinsic to design education, but is undervalued in institutions that determine academic value to a large extent based on quantitative research metrics, which schools of architecture have recently uncritically absorbed without questioning the biases that operate at their core. Those rooted, for example, in the dogma of scientific reason, the historic split between mind and body, or metric and matter, that are highly gendered dichotomies, just as equality-minded feminists don the uniforms and suits of their male counterparts without interrogating the hidden anthropocentric subjectivities intrinsic to the norms to which they were subscribing. Within academia, where research and rationality are deemed more important than creativity, and where metrics often trump poetics, architecture schools will always operate at a disadvantage, given that they are being pressured to assimilate to a value structure that ensures in advance the subjugation and devaluation of their core practices. So how does one quantify the number of times a work of architecture is viewed and experienced, and the impact that this might have on a life, on a population, or on the next generation of cultural makers? Why is it that writing about architecture is more significant from a research perspective than drawings and images that might more closely align with their reality and that are a critical part of their theorization and representation? These are questions that attempt to acknowledge the ways in which architecture has already been cast as a feminine discipline within the academy, and its recent attempts to be taken more seriously by adopting masculinist research paradigms instead of looking for more creative transformations of those paradigms. And within the context of advanced computational and building technologies, and we could say this is also another highly gendered area, engineering is probably the only field worse than architecture in terms of the number of women, that in computer science. Women's entry into this arena can move toward a strategic rethinking, such as was evident in the innovation of our design-driven manufacturing studio or the robotic drawing workshop. As a potential space of critique, transformation, and affirmation, women might inhabit these subdisciplines in order to reinvent their practices while simultaneously redirecting them to support rather than dominate the living. The transformation within the field of architecture is certainly evident in both the quantity of women now graduating from architecture schools today and the diversity and extraordinary quality of their work, which I would say follows no simplistic gendered categorization, perhaps for the very reason that their evolution has already exceeded the conceptual framing of the feminisms of the last century and has enabled them to focus on and collectively write their own conceptual and material futures, rather than either inadvertently assimilating to male normative behaviors or being mired in architectural histories that are focused on the exclusion and subjugation of women. And while the project of continuously mining, theorizing, and writing this absent or unseen history is obviously critical and necessary to deepen our collective memory, I don't believe that it's the place from which the next generation will find its voice. What is perhaps more important are the ways in which architectural education and practice, as vital matters in their own right, are being regendered due to the very real transformation of the population within it. The fact of women operating within this field in and of itself is the one thing that will trigger that transformation. The necessity for women for us to write our own history as women, as stated by Hélène Cixous, would seem to be the only way forward, and is one that demands that we interrogate and continually challenge the assumptions that we've inherited. And this can point to specific opportunities for architectural education and practice by scrutinizing the theoretical frameworks that are operating within our disciplines, while strategically applying those that have emerged from feminist discourses onto the very structures of our discipline as tools for us. This, of course, needs to happen concurrent with concrete initiatives that ensure that there are women as visible leaders and role models at all levels of education and practice, and that they are being recognized for their ongoing work. And perhaps through this process, we'll not only educate an entirely different type of female architectural practitioners, but we might also dissolve the gap that currently exists between education and practice, so that the regendering of architectural education ultimately contributes to the creative regendering of architectural practice. And with that, I will stop. So thank you very much. And I'll stop screen sharing.
Thank you, Ila, for a wonderful and thought-provoking presentation. So we have about 15 minutes left for the Q&A. If you haven't already done so, please type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and you'll have the option to ask anonymously or provide your name, and Fatini and I will read the questions aloud for Ila. We'll give everyone a couple minutes to send in their questions. So we have the first question in. Upon getting into architecture school, I was in my late 20s, married with adult responsibilities such as a mortgage and pets. The brutal studio schedule, last-minute deliverables, unpredictable critiques that often went over class time, and intense course load forced me to leave my part-time job and become dependent on my partner. The extreme educational demands and financial dependence caused enough tension and pressure on my partner that the marriage also dissolved. What can be done to ensure that the educational path is accessible to women in all walks of life, with real-life financial and family life demands?
That's a really good question. I mean, when we think about the structure, one of the things that I didn't deal with at all is the structure of our education. The demand, the expectation, for example, that first there's only a very particular type of student, you know, that can devote all of their time and has endless resources to their education. The fact that we don't have part-time education in architecture, that we don't think about what it means to have a kind of healthy life while we're still working hard within this, are part of the problems of the way that we understand education in general. And I would say that that's something that's changing over time, less so within architecture schools than in some other fields where the idea of the mid-career professional, you know, being able to come back to school, or people having lives. It's an enormous issue with all of our graduate students who might be older and also, you know, have families and things like that. And when I talk about different subjectivities, the same thing can apply to architectural practice, because the whole idea of having children and raising them. And this is always something that, despite that, that over time, the roles of co-parenting has changed, the majority of the burden still falls upon the woman. And yet, this is the time when, it's the same time when people are going to school, it's the same time when people are expected to move through practice, and we haven't rethought how practice and education might be restructured in order to support that. And that's specifically because, again, of its gendered history. So I think that's something that has to be brought to the table. We're talking about that now in terms of enabling graduate students to have to basically study part-time and what that might mean.
Thanks, Ila. Another question we have here is, what are tangible, real ways to demand change in the male-dominant architecture profession? The last all-female panel of architects whom I asked this question told me to stop being shy at work. I'm talking about systemic change in the educational institutions and professional associations that govern architectural practice. Which organizations do we put pressure on, and how?
Well, it's a difficult question because, and I see this time and time again, you know, it's the one thing, both being an architecture professor and a dean, you know, I will watch women stand up in front of their projects, and the projects can be absolutely amazing, and they will be quiet, apologetic, etc. And then I'll watch some guy stand up. He can have nothing on the wall and be the most confident person in the world, you know, and present his project. And so part of this, it's not just about, it's about our expectations of what we consider to be positive communication, right? That being confident, you know, kind of bellowing in a room, that confidence is meaningful in and of itself, no matter what is there, you know, no matter what work is done. And this is always a challenge, but it's also about our value system, right? It's because just the fact that that is what is seen to be valuable within our society, that gets projected. So when we tell women to act a certain way, what we're basically doing is we're telling them to act more like men, you know, or to what might come more naturally. I don't want to make, you know, huge, broad generalizations here within this, but, you know, I can tell you as someone that's hired a lot of people, every guy that walks into my office will negotiate. I've seen it happen over and over and over again. And it's about self-value. And you can say that that's also part of socialization, right? Depending on not just how you were raised within your own environment, but what society tells you every single day in subtle and not so subtle ways. I always say that, that I can thank my parents, that I was lucky in the sense that I felt that I was raised as a person, not as a man or a woman, but as a person. But there was some point in my life later on, you know, when I started, it was less in architecture school, but when I started practicing, that it hit me like a wall of bricks, you know, that what I thought of myself was different than the way in which the world would perceive me. And so this is about changing cultural value. It's not just about changing the organizations. It's about changing value within our society, and that only happens when women have that voice.
Thank you. So we have another question. Upon completing my first architecture studio course, I asked my award-winning male architect instructor what skills I needed to develop and how I could be a better architect. He said, "Don't get pregnant." What can be done in architectural education and internship practices to accommodate women who want or already have children to also succeed in their careers and education?
Well, I think the profession needs to change. I mean, this comes down to the issue again of what our expectations are, right? And that comment itself, you know, is something that probably should have been a lawsuit because that kind of discrimination is what all of the laws against discrimination against women were put in place for exactly that reason. That constitutes sexual harassment. Even something, a statement such as that says that the way in which you will succeed is by not getting pregnant is problematic. And he should have been called out for that. But I think that beyond that, there are all kinds of other ways that we have to be rethinking the profession and practice. I mean, obviously, flexible work hours, the idea that we shouldn't, it shouldn't come down to the idea that you're either full-time or you're not. Why is it that we don't have daycare centers that are built into all of our institutions, all of our public institutions? Why aren't they part of that? Flexible work hours or part-time, different kinds of part-time appointments should be something that should be considered in general and not to be something that is lesser. And this is also an issue. But that's only going to happen if women construct that as a practice. And the difficulty there is saying, what does it take to do that? Do you have to be the partner in the firm, that sets that up as a model? But that's how it has to happen. And it's something, that institutions like, the architectural associations, et cetera, the provincial ones, the federal ones are also ones that need to be taking this on, because that's the way that it operates within a kind of legal environment.
Thanks, Ila. Another question here is, how do you see practice and education to be restructured to accommodate non-binary queer perspectives in architecture?
I think that in some ways, my advice on this is exactly the same when I said that women have to construct their own futures. It's the same for non-binary or queer perspectives. As a lesbian, I get called upon every single time. We did the first LGBTQ plus session for the AIA in Las Vegas a couple of years ago. And one of the things that we were dealing with was the issue, one of the biggest issues, is that people are, 50% of people are still closeted at work or within their educational environment, and not having necessarily a voice at the table, So bringing it, the one thing that I would suggest, first of all, is bringing it into your own work, asking yourself how your perspective might change the way that you think about architectural practice, might change the way that you think about public space and what that means. And that would in some ways disrupt the kind of binary system and the binary structure that itself is historically part of patriarchy. When I refer to the feminine as a kind of strategic positioning, it's not to say that women should be adopting what was constructed as the feminine within patriarchal history, but rather to use it as a kind of strategic tool. And I think there's there's certainly a lot of great queer culture and theory that can be used to undo our normative structures within architectural education and practice.
Thank you. The next question is, why are little or no importance given to mental health in architecture schools and after in the industry?
I'm assuming by that you're referring to within school, the support itself. I mean, I just actually hired a therapist for our students for 20 hours a week, basically for part-time. And in the first week that she started, she was fully booked up, and I mean, students have access, of course, to the health center at the university, but the students wanted somebody in the School of Architecture. So we hired somebody to come in, and it's basically was to support the stress, which is not just, the stress that that students of architecture deal with, but the stress that students deal with in general, within education. I don't think that we deal with it well within our profession. And this is something, and this is part of the question of the gendering of the kind of competition culture, that says, if you're not working round the clock, then, you're not going to succeed. And that's problematic.
Another question we have here. I noted that there were a great majority of white women and their achievements in your slides. Do you have any thoughts on the parallel or unified fight for racial and class diversity along with lived experience in the design profession, and how people in privileged positions may speak to it?
Yeah, I mean, that's an enormous, it's an enormous issue. And I would say, drawing from, I use, let's say, feminist theoretical strategies, but at the same time, obviously strategies that deal with race and ethnicity operate using a similar structure. I mean, Cornel West, for example, I draw from Cornel West in thinking about feminism in the way that he might be operating in relation to race. And those biases, I mean, some of the things that I was referring to in relation to the Next Cities work that we're doing, for example, the indigenous communities in the Arctic, or our work in India or in Latin America. And the challenges there are how you partnership, how you don't operate sort of as the colonizer, right? That coming from the West, that you have answers, et cetera, but instead it's how you engage those communities and how we're supporting other voices and bringing them to the table. But thank you for noting that in relation to my slide, because that's true. It's something that I think is will be, again, the kind of next generation of those in practice. The wave that we're dealing right now, of course, in the States, has been all about dealing with issues of race and how we deal with that in the classroom.
So the next question, if women are meant to construct their own futures and not change organizations like the RAIC, AIBC, AAA, and educational institutions, don't they just come under fire for being too demanding by their employers? Are there specific ways to lobby for change outside of modeling personal behavior in the workforce? Where do we put pressure in the organization system to have bylaws and structures changed?
So the first thing I'll say is, when I say women should be constructing their own futures, I don't mean not to change those organizations. Those organizations very much need to be changed. And one of the ways that you start changing it is by becoming active as somebody who might lead that institution, becoming involved in it and taking a leadership role. I mean, I guess one of the reasons that that I'm a dean is that I use that power as a dean to advocate for women or underrepresented minorities, et cetera, within the power that I have. And I would say that we need to be operating on all fronts. So it's not simply about constructing your own future, but it's more to say that you can rewrite those organizations. Those organizations exist because of their history, and that history evolves and can change. And when women take that on as part of their work, that's how they're going to be changed, by rewriting those laws, or those bylaws, et cetera. And it is a critical part of the process. I mean, I was showing a lot of the legal pieces that were part of the history of feminism to just see how something as simple, as a single legislative act could make a difference, you know, and the impact that that could have. And I think that's the way we should be thinking about many of these things.
Thanks, Ila. I think we have exceeded the time for the Q&A session. I just really want to thank you for joining us tonight. It's always a pleasure to listen to your talks and your lectures. And I just would like to ask everyone, if you're interested, you may sign up for our emailing list on the BEAT website at www.beatoronto.com to receive notifications for more upcoming virtual events, and follow us on Instagram at beat_TO. I just would also like to let everyone know that your presentation will be posted on our YouTube channel very soon.
Thank you, everyone. It's been great.
Thanks, Ila. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a good night.
Yes, you too.